Hello everyone, this is a brief supplemental episode that comes out of the one I produced on the history of Zionism and the Jaffa riots. To get a better sense of Zionist motivations in the 1920s, and frankly the most generous interpretation possible of what was driving the aggressive takeover of Palestine, I read Professor Jeffrey Veidlinger's book, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the pogroms of 1918 to 21 and the onset of the Holocaust. I must admit I hadn't been aware of the sheer extent of violence directed against Jews in Eastern Europe post-World War I. It seems like at least 100,000 were murdered. I also certainly wasn't aware, as I highlighted in the episode, that people were predicting the erasure of Eastern Europe's 6 million Jews that far back. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight one passage from the book which jumped out at me. It is an attempt to explain how pogroms, these horrific massacres, arise, and more specifically, how they draw otherwise normal people into looting and murdering their own neighbours. Whether it's Palestine or Ukraine or anywhere, I think one of the most disturbing aspects of survivors' accounts is that they knew, and had known for years, some of their assailants. Writing about the Shatoma massacre, Professor Veidlinger states, quote, "It was perpetuated not just by marauding troops, but by an array of ordinary citizens, trusted servants, neighbourhood peasants, students, women and children, and even eventually sophisticated urbanites." End quote. He goes on to present three different and contrasting positions on the madness of crowds. Quote, "The French psychologist Gustave Le Bon, one of the founders of the study of group psychology, wrote in 1895 about the characteristics of crowds. In a large group, he posited, individuals become part of, quote, a sort of collective mind which makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual of them would feel, think, and act were he in a state of isolation." End quote. A generation later, in 1921, Sigmund Freud challenged Le Bon's analysis, expressing doubt that new personalities could suddenly appear ex nihilo. Instead, Freud proposed, the seemingly uncharacteristic way in which individuals behave as part of a crowd are actually already embedded within the individual but are usually repressed. In a crowd, he wrote, quote, "The individual is brought under conditions which allow him to throw off the repressions of his unconscious instincts." End quote. Le Bon may have argued that in Shatoma, the crowd turned individuals into anti-Semites, whereas Freud would have said that it just gave them the opportunity to express previously repressed anti-Semitic feelings. Decades later, both of these arguments were challenged by the American sociologist Mark Granovetter, who questioned the notion that the kind of sudden changes in people's behaviour observed in riots resulted either from the emergence of new norms and beliefs or from the stripping away of the veneer of civilization. Instead, Granovetter took as his starting point the idea that the, quote, cost to an individual of joining a riot declines as the riot size increases, end quote. Each individual, he suggested, has his or her own threshold for joining a riot, a point at which the costs of staying out of the riot exceed the costs of participating. Some are instigators and will be the first to smash windows. Others will join only if it seems that everybody else is doing so. End quote. Those three views certainly contrast, but maybe also complement each other. Le Bon is certainly observing a real phenomenon, in that a collective mind seems to take over. But perhaps this is a mythologization of the cumulative action of individual minds. Maybe Freud is zooming in and getting the details correct. Equally, the existence of repressed hatreds does not exclude the action of economic forces, either to benefit from looting when the cost is sufficiently lowered, or to not risk being the outsider who didn't participate. Now, this of course makes me think of the madness of the COVID crowd. Certainly, and in line with Le Bon, a sort of collective mind emerged out of nowhere and spanned the globe. Perhaps, however, it didn't emerge out of nowhere, but rather in the Freudian sense, the COVID narrative allowed people's repressed thirst for power to emerge as a legitimized force. People on every level of society suddenly had the power to enforce mask wearing, whereas university academics with histories of failed predictions could shut down entire countries. Perhaps there was also the emergence of repressed needs, the need to think of oneself as virtuous, to have mundane existence transformed into a life or death struggle against a virus, to suddenly have a sense of in-group connection in this task, albeit socially distanced connection. There must also have been an economic calculation being made. There was certainly a cost incurred by not going along with the mandates, placing oneself in an outgroup. It is then surely easier to believe it's all meaningful, all true. If you have to go along with the crowd in any case, then what's the value in questioning any of it? Surely the townspeople in Chitoma told themselves they were acting virtuously, ridding Ukraine of parasitic Jews. Arabs in Palestine doubtless saw themselves as being virtuous when employing violence to stop the Jewish invasion. Jews doubtlessly saw themselves similarly when they engaged in counter-violence. Okay, that will do it for now. Thanks for listening. Let me know any thoughts. I may well expand on this theme in the future. I am particularly interested in how much of the COVID era can be explained purely by the madness of crowds, by people following their own self-interest, and at what point that becomes insufficient and a more conspiratorial explanation is required.